Hello and welcome to another podcast for Dreambubble. Today we've got a very exciting podcast lined up for you. I am Phreaky. I am hoping that you're joining for a second time, having watched our previous roundtable podcast. We are taking a slightly different approach this time, and joining me today is the most epic Mandelbo. Hello, Mr. Mandelbo.
Oh, hello, Phreaky. You've hyped me up a bit. I'm not sure I can perform.
Deservedly so, sir. Deservedly so. Something of a musical legend. Something of a musical legend.
Oh, crikey.
So, here we are in Dreams, and we're going to be talking about music today. But we're going to be talking about it from a slightly different point of view. We're going to be talking about it from principles, I think, is the best way to phrase it, isn't it?
Yeah, I'd say that's right. I'm quite interested in talking really about the process of making a song and the do's and don'ts, and more kind of the mechanics of it, as well as a little bit on the theory side as well of what sort of things should be going through your mind when you're making a song, and sort of how to get started with making music and how to continue to get better as well. So hopefully it's helpful to someone.
Excellent. No, so personally, I'm looking forward to this because I kind of. So I tell you what, I'll start off by doing a demonstration of how I would approach doing music, and then we can talk about how you actually do music and how it should be done.
Yeah, let's go ahead.
Because this will be hilarious for anyone involved. So here we go. What I tend to do is I go into the relevant thing, find me an instrument from the brand new Plinky Instruments. Let's
nice choice.
Go for some strings. I actually really like the full string section pizzicato. And I'll go in there, and I will I'll do one of two things. I'll either take an audio piece that I know really well, and using my first grade type musical knowledge, I will map it out on here, which will take me several hours. Or I will instead go, I want to play in the key of F minor. That's what I'll do. And then I will go, now I shall make music. No, I haven't done anything with the beats per minute or the rhythm or the time signature or any of the other insert musical terminology here. I will literally just go. Look at me, I made a music.
Just plonk some notes down. I mean, to be perfectly honest, like, that's not an awful lot different from what I do, really.
Shenanigans.
Okay, well, I mean, in terms of how I would approach making a piece, I come from a background of having been taught how to play the piano. Okay. So I typically don't start pieces off in Dreams. What I tend to do is I sit down at a piano, which I'm extremely lucky to have one, and I kind of just improvise until I come across something that I quite like, something that sounds all right. This is typically like a chord progression or a series of notes that could work well as a melody. And then I go, okay, that kind of works. And then I have to go through the laborious process of working out, okay, what key is that in? Okay, what time signature is that in? Okay, hang on, what's the BPM of that? And then after I kind of know that, I can get to work putting it into Dreams. And to be perfectly honest, more times than not, it doesn't go very well because it's trying to transpose something that's basically just in my head into the game. But that's typically how I approach it. Either that, or I think of like a melody. I'm not near a piano or anything or Dreams. So what I do, and this is going to sound very, very stupid, but I tend to get my phone out and record myself humming or whistling a song so that I can remind myself of it later and not completely forget. And it sort of works sometimes.
That's brilliant. I think that's a genius idea. I mean, I hadn't really thought of that, to be honest with you. That's a brilliant idea. I mean, one of the frustrations I have as a non-musician, one of my frustrations is that I often feel like I have in my head a piece of music playing, and it sounds incredible in my head because I know exactly how I want it to sound. But I don't know how to translate that into something that is tangible in dreams in front of me on a timeline. I have no idea how to even begin doing that.
Oh, see, this is the thing. I completely understand this, and this is something I still find difficult to do. Like as I say, a lot of the times when I try to transpose something into dreams or like transfer something from my head into something concrete, it doesn't work because I can't get it to sound quite the same as it does in my head, or something is inexplicably off about it. Because I mean, I feel like part of the problem is when when I hear something in my head, when I get a song idea, and I imagine you can empathize with this because I feel like this is the same problem. When I've got a song in my head, it's the entire thing. It's the entire song rather than bits of the song, rather than individual parts. And so when you put something down, when you start to compose a piece, obviously you're not going to start with everything. You're going to start with the pieces of the jigsaw even. And when you just have one part, or even if you're lucky, like two parts, it won't sound the same, and you really have got to work at it before it starts to resemble what you had in your head to start with, and that can take a long time, honestly. And as I said, a lot of the time, sometimes it doesn't coalesce, which can be disheartening, especially if you're starting out and you're like, I've got all these superb ideas, but I just don't have the skills to get them down. And this is something that really only gets better with practice, honestly. I'm still not great at it. Like, I've got loads of rubbish in my save creations that I'm never showing anyone because they're half-formed ideas, but it's something that affects everyone. Even I don't want to say even people like me because that sounds very, very pompous.
And we have our soundbite.
No, don't be mean to me.
Not at all.
Don't be mean.
It's absolutely fine. One of the things I find particularly challenging is that if I take the pizzicato strings that I just got, one of the things I love about these strings particularly is that delicate, almost blink. You know, it's a really delicate sound. But what I find is that when I put that into a piece of audio, along with percussion and woodwind instruments and a piano and all the rest of it that sits over the top of that, one of the challenges that I then have is that it all seems to just become a bit... I don't know what the right technical phrase is for this, but it just all becomes... It lacks depth, I suppose, is the phrase?
You know, I completely understand what you're talking about. I feel like when you put lots of instruments together on a timeline like that, it's very, very easy for it to come out feeling unrefined and feeling like it's messy. Even if all the pieces line up together in theory, it's very difficult sometimes to get them to actually work together in the way you can imagine them to do. And to be honest, it takes a great deal of skill that I don't really have to get that to work reliably. But I completely understand. And that's actually something I want to cover when it comes to making music, sort of the aspects of producing it to make it sound good. If you follow.
Yeah, I think that sounds really good. And you know, one of the things that I know of, but I don't fully understand, is something that I know that both Ed and Bogdan have spoken about separately, and that's effective volume control.
Yes.
So is that volume control, the starting point?
You are completely correct, Mr. Phreaky.
Hooray!
Right. Absolutely right. The dynamics of of your piece. The dynamics is a fancy music word for effectively the volume and the way how loud everything is, basically how loud and how quiet things are. Managing that effectively is one of, if not the most important things to be aware of when you're composing music. When you want things to sound like they're refined and sound like sound professional, for want of a better word. Because really, I know a lot of people think that the difficult part of the music is coming up with it, and that is difficult. But honestly, I feel like the art of mixing it and getting it to sound right it's a science all of its own. And in my opinion, it can be even harder sometimes because it takes such a lot of time and dedication to get something right. And people build whole careers and jobs out of mixing songs and getting the volumes right and getting everything right and getting the balancing correct. So it's not something that you just kind of pick up, but equally, it's definitely not something you should ignore. So I would quite like to go over that, yes. And I feel like what you said, well, Ed and Bogdan do go over this, and I feel like effective volume management is something that a lot of dreams composers, particularly composers who started out in dreams, and people who are just starting to compose. It's something that excuse me, it's something that they don't consider, not because they're being lazy. Obviously, I don't think anyone's lazy when they come to making music, but it's more out of a sense of not knowing how much it can benefit a piece, really. So I kind of think that the concept of dynamics can really be explained better if you think of it in a practical setting. So I'm going to start an analogy now, Phreaky. Let's go.
I like analogies. I live and breathe analogies. Analogize away, sir.
Yeah, best way to live in an analogy. Perfect. Right. So imagine, for the purposes of this, that you are sat in the middle of an auditorium. It might be quite difficult because it is 2020, but bear with me. So you're in the middle of an auditorium and there's a band practicing on the stage. It's your job with the band to make sure that they're arranged correctly on the stage so that they can all be heard clearly. So you have both the depth of the stage to consider and how they're positioned left and right on the stage, for instance. Now let's imagine, for instance, they don't have speakers or anything. They're just playing to you. So if you're considering that they are physical players, they're actual people playing instruments, two things should be quite obvious immediately. The first thing is that you cannot have every member of the band stood directly at the front of the stage because there is not enough space for everyone at the front of the stage. There's physically is not room for people to be there. Additionally, some instruments are naturally louder than others. So, for instance, drums are very loud and boomy, well, in some cases. They're much louder, for instance, than a flute or a piano, so you wouldn't want them to occupy the same space. Equally, you cannot have every member of the band stood directly in the center of the stage too, because that would involve them standing in exactly the same place, which would either mean they're on top of each other or they're defying the laws of physics. So you can't have that. They've all got to have their own defined regions on the stage.
With you so far.
Okay. Well, that's good because that's effectively where the analogy ends. So when you're composing in any sort of music composition software, honestly, but with Dreams it works as well, you're sort of playing with the same rules, even though you're not dealing with physical instruments. You don't have to deal with the physical constraints of it, but it's still very important to be aware of the principles of spacing things out and how to manage the presence of an instrument. So it's something that sounds quite banal and boring, but it is. Knowing these principles can really help elevate a song that's pretty good to a song that's really quite excellent. So I would like to start actually with volume, because it's probably the easiest thing to get started with, and I don't want to say it's really basic, because it's not. It's a science. It's a really hard science getting the volume right. So
Okay.
yeah, okay. So I'll basically start off. When you're composing a piece, I personally feel that you should really be aiming to control your volume across. You should be aiming to have your instruments be playing across a very wide range of volumes right from the start. Now, it can be tempting not to do this, because in Dreams, instruments are given default settings that sort of ensure they never really overpower one another. So if you plonk an instrument down and you plonk it like over the top of a couple of other ones, chances are it's not going to immediately stand out in the mix. It's going to kind of play nicely with everything else. But the problem is, the more instruments you have, the more this volume collectively builds up. And it can get to the point where parts get lost in the mix, and as you were talking about before, it can kind of cause the piece to feel a bit unrefined and a bit messy, because everything is fighting for prominence right at the front of the mix. Because if everything is loud, then there's no balance, there's no levels. Everything is shouting to try and be the loudest thing, right?
Yes.
And this is something I've been guilty of myself. This is something that is incredibly difficult to get right. But it's doubly important in Dreams, I feel, to know about this, because something you might not know is that Dreams has got a built-in audio limiter. So on its master audio channel, what this effectively means is if Dreams notices the volume is getting too loud, it starts to crush it. It starts to squash the volume. It starts to squash the audio that's coming through in an attempt to make it quieter. So you're never going to get audio distorting through this, which is what happens on other music composition tools, such as like Cubase, Ableton, and even in stuff like Audacity, this happens, where if you push something too loud, the sound starts to physically degrade, and you'll hear it crackling and sputtering, and it will sound like the sound is breaking. This doesn't happen in Dreams, which in a sense makes it more forgiving, because when you make a mistake, you're not going to be hearing the artifacts of it. But on the flip side, it makes it much harder to know when you have made a mistake, because you're only really going to notice if you've hit that limiter if you're listening for it. If you know it's there and you're trying to pick out whether the things that should be loud actually are loud.
Right.
So because of this, because there's no visual indication that you've pushed past the limit and it's crushing the audio, I find it much, much easier to err on the side of making things quieter to begin with. And then once I have all my parts in the scene, in the timeline, then I can work about pushing them louder and balancing it out properly then. Because in my head, it's much better to have a piece that's a bit on the quiet side than a piece that's too loud and is missing bits as a result, or is drowning bits out.
Okay. So, just so I can kind of make sure that I understand what we're saying so far, is
Okay,
that
go ahead.
so you start off and you have a couple of notes put down for any given instrument. Do you then immediately bring the volume down on that?
What I tend to do is that's along the right area. What I try to do is once I have instruments in the mix, like, okay, say I have, well, you're looking at piano right now.
Yeah.
So once the piano has accompaniment, so when I've got some parts down, when I've started layering instruments up, if I get to the point where I've like got a melody and that I've got stuff going, I don't like immediately think about the volume before I have the bass, like the baseline of the song done or started at least. So when I start introducing pieces on top of each other, when I start fleshing things out, then I start to think about the volume. So for instance, here you've got your piano and you've got a drum section.
Yes.
I probably wouldn't be thinking about. Well, no, you've got not got piano. You've got a pizzicato section. Sorry,
Yeah.
You've got a string section and some drums. That's 2 bits, and I would probably not be worrying too much about the volume at this stage because you're just getting started. Really, you're just getting started in the song. Maybe wait until it pans out a bit more before you go back in and start getting to the nitty gritty. But my point is, you need to be thinking about this sort of stuff sooner rather than later. More because if you leave it till the end to balance out all the parts, it becomes much, much harder to do so. Because naturally, if you wait till the end of the song, once the song's finished, you've got like a whole bunch of instruments fighting against each other. And the more things you've got to manage, the harder it is, basically. So I wouldn't start it immediately, but as soon as I could, as soon as it would make a difference, I would start looking at the dynamics and the volume.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, I understand. That makes sense. I'm with you so far.
Okay. I'd also just like to make a side note here. This is sort of relevant to volume, but something I see a lot of composers in Dreams doing is doubling up instruments, so to speak. So what they'll do is they'll notice that perhaps an instrument isn't popping out enough in the mix as much as they would like to. So to make it louder, assuming they've maxed out the volume anyway and it hasn't fixed the problem, what they'll do is copy the part and have multiple instances of the same part playing at once. So changing nothing about it other than duplicating the instrument and copying it a bunch of times.
Okay, so for the sake of me, because I do this, I've done this before, I'm just going to demonstrate this live in audio, and we can see what you mean. So what we're saying is, here I am with my grand piano that I've done a dinky little melody on. Here we go. And that's a particular volume. I'm not happy with that. And even when I push that right the way up, so that's now at 100% volume. Boo hiss, that's still not loud enough. So what I would do, and what I have done in the past, is I just clone that, stick it in, and then... That sounds much louder to me. But you're telling me no.
Phreaky, it hurts. I can't look at it. It's hurting me to see this.
Okay.
Right. The thing about this, right, is that in principle, it's a sound conclusion to come to. If one of the instruments isn't loud enough, then surely 2 of them will fix that problem. But the issue is, it's not solving anything. This is, if anything, making the original problem worse. Because what's happening here is you're artificially raising that instrument up in the mix to the point where it can drown things out underneath it, right?
Okay.
So, which is really not very good. If something's at 100% volume and it's still not loud enough, then it's perhaps easier, or well, it makes more sense to consider that the problem isn't coming from the instrument being too quiet, but rather everything else in the context around it is collectively too loud. Because chances are, if a piece isn't popping out in the mix enough, it might be because it's being smothered by other things rather than it inherently being too quiet to hear. So
okay.
Yes.
Let me kind of try and wrap my head around this with one of my analogies then.
Well, go ahead, I want to hear an analogy.
If I am in a football stadium surrounded by thousands and thousands and thousands of screaming fans, me screaming twice as loud isn't going to make someone in the center of the pitch hear me.
Exactly.
Whereas
right, I'm not...
if I told everyone else in the stadium to not scream and shout, and they were all silent, and I screamed the same amount, someone in the center of the pitch is going to hear me more. Have I got that right?
Yes. Yes,
Okay.
you have. Right. I'm not a football person, but I can damn well imagine what that would look like. So you're completely correct. It's if you're thinking about boosting an instrument really, really loudly, you're ignoring the wider context of the piece it exists in, and that doesn't solve the problem of everything else being so loud that it drowns it out in the first place, which in turn makes it much easier to hit that audio limiter and then push everything else down. So what you'll end up doing is, for instance, if you add another piece later, another instrument into your song, you will potentially find it much harder to balance that as well, because you can get into the point where it's a shouting match of pushing everything louder and louder and louder to the point where everything's murky and everything's loud and there's no sort of balancing between anything.
Okay.
Which is very bad. It's very bad.
Okay, I'm with you so far. So if I have a quick look at these three instruments I've got here, and they are just set to defaults, volume-wise. So this is what the three instruments sound like together. What I was going to do was make this keyframe turn the volume down on some of these appropriately, so you would hear it switch from being loud, 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 loud to appropriately engineered or somewhat engineered, so it wasn't quite so bad.
No, that sounds perfect. That's a really good way of doing it. Yes.
So what I'll do is I'll record the keyframe and I'll take down, for example, the drum kit and the piano, so it brings up the pizzicato.
The way you do this, the way you manage your audio, kind of depends. The way you manage the volume, even, kind of depends on what it is you want to be in the forefront. So typically, the thing you want to draw the listener's attention the most is the main melody, perhaps. So you would want that sitting more at the forefront of the mix. So maybe you would have the volume on that nearest the top. As in, not at 100%, but relative to the other instruments, you would want it to be more prominent and louder. Whereas accompanying instruments and stuff would be lower down because they're not as centrally important to the piece as the melody. This is just one example, obviously.
Okay, so let's play that example out then. So let's say, hypothetically, that here I am in my full string pizzicato, and I really like my melody. I think this is the best melody I've ever written in my life. At the moment, my drum kit and my grand piano are at the various volumes that they are at by default, but it's drowning out the pizzicato because that's naturally a plinky plunky softly softly instrument. If I were to, instead of ramping my volume up significantly on the pizzicato, which is going to, I think you said, crush the audio?
Yes, it will crush it. It crushes the audio. It lowers everything.
Okay, so instead, if I use this keyframe here to, let me just see if I can do this. So if I use my keyframe here to instead, when this keyframe comes in, reduce the volume down on these other things, what this should do is essentially demonstrate live, by the power of Dreams, what that would mean in terms of the experience of that pizzicato just by lowering the volume of those two when this keyframe comes in. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does make sense. And theoretically, obviously I've not heard it yet, but theoretically what that should do, without having touched the full string section at all, is it should make it more prominent in the mix by virtue of the other things being lowered, because you'll still be able to hear them perfectly fine, but you want to draw attention to the pizzicato, so naturally it should be more at the front, and the other things should be lower down. So yes, that should work perfectly.
Okay, so I'm going to play this through now. So here we are. All right, here we go. Let's see. Okay, I can say categorically that I heard a significant difference in terms of the audio quality there. The
Yes. See?
pizzicato, very much, I was drawn much more to them, and the drum kit and the piano were still there, but it wasn't as kind of...
There's more dynamism. It's more dynamic because you haven't got
Ooh.
everything playing at the same volume, at the same in level of intensity. Actually, one other little tip, because your drum kit, right? Your drum kit is all in one instrument track, which is a completely valid way of approaching it. But if you consider for a moment that a drum kit is actually made out of lots of different sounding, it's made out of lots of different sounding parts. So you've got, for instance, you've got the bass drum, you have the snare, you have tom toms, you've got the cymbals, you've got hi hats, for instance, all of which sound crucially very, very different to one another. So maybe what you'd like to do, and this is not a suggestion, by the way, this is not me going, you should be doing this. What can be quite helpful to do is split your drum kit single track off into several distinct tracks for each type of drum you're playing with. So you could have a track for just the bass drum, and a track just for the snare, and a track just for the hi-hats, and so on, which then allows you to modify the volume of each independently of each other. So this is a technique that you'll often find people using in recording studios. What they'll tend to do is, instead of using one microphone to record the entire drum set, you'll use several microphones mic'd on different bits of the drum kit to capture that.
Okay, penny drop moment for me. That's why there's always a microphone poking into that silly hole in the bass drum.
Yes, that's precisely why. It's because when you have the microphone inside the bass drum, you're getting the resonant sound of the kick, but you get less of the swing of the pendulum and the kick itself. You're getting the sound of the inside of the drum, and that's all you're getting, which is the whole... It allows you to be much more creative when you're mixing it and when you're putting the bits together, because then you have control over what just the bass drum sounds like and what just the snares sound like, and that makes it so much easier to be dynamic and raise things to the forefront and push things to the side that don't need to be there. That it's a really good technique to make use of, I think, doing that.
Fantastic. That makes sense. I understand that now.
Yes.
I'm liking this. This is starting. My masterpiece is coming together. My Phreaky symphony is taking shape. Okay.
Also, just another little thing, because I mentioned recording techniques. If you want to get really nitty gritty about it, when you're recording, say, a piano, you typically wouldn't use just one microphone to do that either, because a piano produces a massive range of sounds that all sound very different from each other. So the higher end notes on a piano are acoustically very different from those on the lower end. So you might, for instance, mic the lower keys. You'd open the case of the piano up and put a microphone inside of it to record those bits, record the hammers hitting those strings down at the bottom, and a different set up at the top. Maybe you'd have a microphone positioned over the keyboard so you can hear the pianist playing the notes. You can hear the notes depressing and such. So from just one instrument, you can get quite a wide array of sounds that you can then play with later. Now, obviously, that exact scenario can't happen in Dreams because we've only got the sounds we're provided with. But the point is, if, for instance, you've got a low-end part on a piano and a high-end part, maybe split those out into different instrument channels as well. Because, as I said, they sound different, so they should be managed differently. So
I understand.
for instance, like, I don't know, maybe you want the bass notes on the piano to be particularly bassy and particularly like crunchy and grimy. So you can apply some effects to that, but leave the higher end melody bit intact, or do what you want with that. Because really, there's no limit on the number of times you do this, the number of specialized little tracks you have going. it just allows you a lot more freedom when you come to really making the song sing, as it were. It's a good technique, I think.
That makes sense. I think from my point of view, one of the things that I think I'm always nervous of, or at least acutely aware of, is that I don't want to do too much in terms of the particular menu systems of all of these various instruments, because I don't know what that does in terms of the music thermometer, the audio thermometer. I'm always nervous with that, and I don't know how to manage my audio thermometer effectively. I mean, graphics and gameplay, I can understand from a first principles point of view. Audio thermometer, I just don't understand in the same way that I do the other two.
Okay, that's perfectly reasonable. I'm going to be perfectly honest with you. I've kind of never worried about the audio thermometer because whenever I've been working with it, it's always kind of stayed under the 30% mark. From what I understand, it matters much more if you're playing with music in a scene with other things happening, because obviously sound effects share the same audio thermometer bank as musical instruments. So if you've got a level that's using a lot of samples for sound effects, and you've got loads and loads of sound design going on, loads of atmospheric things going on, and stuff like that, and then you drop a relatively complex music track in there as well, then you will have an impact. You will notice things going wrong there. But it's more the audio thermometer is more to do with the number of samples the game has to deal with. So effectively the number of unique instruments and sounds going on at once. So if you're copying, for instance, before with your drum kit, separating that out into 4 rows for each bit of the drum won't be affecting the thermometer, because it's all those lanes of instruments are working from the same bank of sounds. So you've got 3 tracks there, but you've got 3 tracks pulling from the same place. So it doesn't really make a difference as far as I'm aware. You should really be more concerned if you're using a lot of instruments or a lot of sounds. But generally, I've found it's very, very difficult to blow that thermometer in the same way it's very easy to go over the graphics limit or the gameplay limit. So, I don't know, but I would just say kind of just have a bit of fun. And if it starts to go really high, then maybe think about reducing things a little bit. But I've always found it to be a lot more forgiving than the other thermos.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think from my point of view, that I can get behind that. It's one of those where it's that fear of the unknown.
Oh no, I completely understand that, and it's worrying when you see it. Well, because there's only 3 thermometers, and they're all displayed with equal prominence, even though they're all measuring a multitude of different things under the surface. But really, it is. I think the primary thing with the audio thermometer is number of unique samples that are present. So you should notice some change when you. I feel like the grand piano might actually have an impact, because from what I remember, that's using several samples. The full dynamics one particularly uses multiple samples depending on how the piano is playing. So there's a bank of samples for when it's softly playing and a bank for when it's hard, which is why in the instrument panel you have either the one for full dynamics, but you also have grand piano soft and grand piano hard, because the grand piano full dynamics menus instrument pulls both of them into the same place, I think, for more expressive performances. But if you only need the loud stuff, you can only have the loud samples loaded, is what I understand that being.
I understand.
Which is cheaper on the memory.
I understand. Okay, so in principle, if I were to replace my grand piano full dynamics with a grand piano soft, in principle, that would make that's made things a little bit less heavy on the thermometer. Yeah. I understand.
So it's not a huge difference there, but the difference is pronounced. Like, I mean, you could potentially get to a situation where 2% of the audio thermometer or 3% is very useful for filling up space with sound effects and stuff like that.
Yes.
It might be, yeah. So that's something you should always consider as well. I feel like it's something you don't have to consider quite as urgently as stuff like, I don't know, volume and all that.
Yes.
And graphics and all the gameplay stuff. But it's something you should think about. Like, do you really need to have all the dynamics at once on the piano, or are you just having loud notes? Because if you're just having loud notes, you don't need the whole stuff, the whole thing. But yes, that's how it works, I think.
Excellent. Okay, thank you for that. That makes a lot of sense. I am 100% with you on that now.
Yay!
Huzzah. Okay, so we've talked about audio volume. So that's, to go back to your analogy, that's everyone on the same stage and person on the left hammering away at the piano keys, and person on the right absolutely blitzing on the violin strings at equal volume. And that just doesn't happen in real life. They have different volumes in real life, and therefore that should be represented within the instruments themselves.
Yeah, or indeed, if it is happening in real life, it really shouldn't be.
And it certainly won't sound good.
It will not. No, exactly. Okay. Yes.
But
also, just before we move on, actually, sorry, I'd like to bring up one more thing.
Of course.
Because all this talk about volume and dynamics it can be very, very difficult to gauge this if you're using your TV speakers. And I know this sounds like I'm coming across as like a bit bourgeoisie by going, ooh, basic TV speakers are rubbish. But the thing is, they kind of are. TV speakers tend to have pretty poor response to sound, and they're not very good at getting the intricacies of a song across. They will sound fine, but I would suggest if you're getting interested in doing music composition and you're interested in listening to other bits of music, I would definitely suggest using a pair of headphones or like earphones or anything plugged into your controller when you're looking at songs or making your own, because it will make it much, much easier to distinguish those levels and to place things in the stereo field, in the realm of the audio. It will make everything much clearer, I think. I don't think I know it will. What am I saying?
Okay.
But headphones are always good. Do that.
Okay. And for the sake of asking the question for my benefit, if nothing else, in-ears or over-ears, or doesn't it matter really?
It's all better than TV speakers.
Excellent.
I'm currently using over-the-ear headphones, but I also use in-ear. It's really personal preference. Like, a lot of people don't like in-ear headphones because they don't like putting things in their ears, and that's perfectly fine. I don't mind, so I use them. But really, like, using actual headphones or actual earphones or actual anything is going to be better than the included television speaker. You'll be able to get a lot more nuance out of it. Even if it's just like basic headphones, it'll be fine. So yeah, definitely use those if you're interested.
Understood. That makes perfect sense. Okay, so we're in a scenario now whereby I've completed my masterpiece and I've got my audio volume to a point where I am over the moon with it. It sounds like liquid velvet pouring directly into my ears from the angels of heavens themselves.
Oh, I wish I could hear it. But it sounds great.
I still have my instruments. What you mentioned before, my instruments are all coming from the same point in terms of space, for want of a better phrase. And I don't know my terminology with this, so please don't make fun of me. But we still
not make fun of you.
Well, no, but you never know.
Don't be rude.
I am the host, therefore you don't get to make fun. But no, so one of the things you mentioned earlier on is the audio all sitting, for want of a better phrase, front and center.
Yes,
now,
yes.
There's some confusion on my part as to what that should be doing.
Okay, right. So this is this is an issue that's kind of adjacent to volume. This is panning, stereo panning. So effectively, the amount at which an instrument is coming out of either the left or right speaker. And for the purposes of this, I'm not going to talk about surround sound or ambisonic panning for VR because it's complicated. But stereo panning is just as important, and you'll be playing with this a lot more if you're making music. So, stereo panning, as I just said, it refers to where in the stereo field a sound is coming from, as in the stereo field being your speakers or your headphones. It refers to the space in which the instruments are placed. So if you look at an instrument and you go to the panning section, the speaker bit on the tooltip bar, if the bar is set to -100, it should only be coming out of the left speaker. And if it's set to 100, it should only be coming out of the right speaker. If you move down one to stereo width, whereas the panning refers to where it's coming from, the width refers to how broad of an area it is coming from. So if the stereo width is set to 0, it's effectively like a pin dropping. It should be coming from one definite exact space in the field. Like, you should be able to pinpoint exactly, like, to the point of, like, being able to visualize in your actual vision where it would be if the sound was in your room or whatever. If it's set to 100, then it can appear to be coming from sort of all around you because the area is very, very broad and the sound is coming from effectively all directions. So you need to make use of both of these when making music. And really, again, it's best not to go with extremes here. So, for instance, I find it much easier when making music to work with a lower stereo width because if I'm working with, for instance, like, let's just say an oboe. An oboe is a very beautiful sound, but also it's not very big. It's coming from a relatively small instrument in one particular space. So really, that shouldn't be wide. That should be quite narrow. It's very good. The stereo width is very good for ambient sounds when it's wider and for making things that kind of sound all-encompassing. But if you have your stereo width higher, it becomes more difficult to accurately place things in the field. So I tend to keep it lower. I haven't actually gone over why you might want to have things positioned across the stereo field. So, I would say it's perhaps easier to ignore panning than it is to ignore volume, because whereas if you ignore your volume, you can get things getting drowned out. When it comes to panning, it's kind of a lot more forgiving because the default settings tend to stick the stereo width around 47%, 50%, which means that even if you stick sounds down and you don't touch the panning at all, chances are you're going to be getting some bleed across the headphones. You're going to be getting some play in the stereo field. It won't sound as if everything is coming from directly in the middle of you because everything is a bit wide, a bit broad. But it's still important to think about panning. You definitely shouldn't ignore it, even if it's quite a lot easier to get away with ignoring it than it is with volume. Because, and this is more for making the song sound full, for want of a better phrase. If you take care to space your instruments out across the stereo field in kind of a naturalistic way, it becomes much easier to give your song some depth and a bit of texture. And if you do it right, if you're really careful with your panning and managing the stereo width and such, it can feel convincing. The song will feel as if it's being played in front of you. It will feel as if the instruments exist in a physical space, with each instrument having their own distinct area. And doing that helps to create a richness, a fullness which you don't really have if you leave everything panned centrally at the default values. Don't get me wrong, like it will still sound fine, but also it can get to the point where it can feel a bit flat, maybe a little bit bland. Like, it won't be bad, so to speak, but it won't really sound like there's much texture to it. It won't sound like there's much going on, in a sense.
So
Also, oh no, sorry, continue.
No, that's
Sorry.
absolutely fine. No, not a problem at all.
What I was gonna say is that this can also be beneficial when you're playing with audio, though, but not audio when you're playing with the volume, even, because, for instance, if a quiet part is panned centrally and everything else is panned centrally, then it's much easier for that quiet thing to be drowned out, to be smothered by everything else that's on top of it. But if you've spaced everything out properly and everything has its own little region, then the quiet part can exist in its own little bit of the stereo field and will hopefully come out a lot more prominently. Even if you've not touched the volume on anything, by virtue of it having its own space, it should come out much more fully. It should be much clearer, and there should be a lot more clarity in the piece. It becomes much easier to pick out each individual sound as it's coming in if they all are spaced out rather than being in the middle, which is very useful, I find.
Okay, so let's take this then to the example that we're looking at here. So if I take my softly piano and I just arbitrarily put that on the left in terms of this speaker icon on the tool for the gadget menu for the instrument, I put that 80% on the left and I put my stereo width again arbitrarily at 25%. And then if I do precisely the same thing for my pizzicato, but the other way around, so I move that to the right at, say, 80%, again, same widget, and again, stereo width about 30%. I've now essentially separated my two instruments into a left and a right, very generally speaking.
Yes, correct.
Okay, so if I now look at my audio, and I set that back to its default. For when it's not on that particular keyframe, what that should mean is that I've then got my audio separated, and again it'll do the same volume trick as necessary. There. Okay, sorry, I realize that I'm not actually really being very helpful when I'm talking.
Fine, it's
I'm talking
okay.
myself through what I'm doing here, because if I don't, I'll get confused, and nobody needs
Don't
that.
worry, I talk to myself all the time when I'm making music. It's normal. I swear it's normal.
That is very reassuring to hear, so thank you. Okay.
There are dozens of us.
Yeah,
It's
I'm not
fine.
alone. I'm not alone. Okay, so again, we've done the audio adjustments, and I'm now going to use exactly the same keyframe in order to try and work out what that does to my stereo width. Is that the right phrase?
What it does to, I would say, what it does to the stereo field, what it does to the positioning and the panning of the instruments, because you're playing with the stereo width, but that's one component of it. So you've got the panning and you've got the width, and they work in tandem.
I definitely heard a difference there.
Yes.
100%.
Well, I'm glad you did. You panned them quite far left and right. So that's, on the face of it, that's fairly extreme. Setting something to 80% on the left, 70-odd% on the right, that's quite a big difference, actually. So that you should be hearing it mostly out of the left, and then the strings mostly out of the right, based on that.
Very, very much so. And I can hear that transition. As soon as it hits that keyframe, I can very much hear that's the moment that it happens.
Precisely. Like, it's a very easy thing to ignore, but when you start playing around with those settings, you can notice just how profound a difference it makes on the overall sound of the song. Like, it really does affect it. in quite a profound way. Actually, one thing I'd quite like to talk about. I feel like quite a good example of a song of mine where I've made use of stereo panning in the past is my entry for the Mashup One not competition, the Mashup One event a few months ago, called "Heating Up in the Hell Gym," which is a very percussive piece, and it's only 4 bars, so it makes it very, very easy to demonstrate. But in that, I've got lots and lots of percussion pieces that are panned across the field. I've got in fact most of the instruments in that song are percussion rather than melodic, and it kind of creates a chaotic texture, and it's very. I feel like I'm just praising myself, but if it has a crunchiness to it that I feel like maybe would demonstrate quite well what panning can do to a piece.
Excellent. So
Yes.
let's bring that in, and then 1, I get a sneak look at your music, and 2, I can then play about with it, which I'm very excited to do.
Yes. By all means, no, seriously, by all means, play around with anything I've made. I would be extremely happy to see that. But yes, it should be. It shouldn't be that far down the list. It was a. Oh yeah, there it is. There it is. It's 4th thing on the list.
Heating Up in the Hell Gym.
Yeah, it's only 4 bars of music because it was for a little event that Ed was running actually.
Okay.
But I feel like this demonstrates the principles I'm talking about fairly well, even if it is only a short piece of music.
Excellent. Okay, so if 4 bars, 160 BPM. This was Ed's mashup that he did.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. It's this
I am
one.
familiar with this piece of music. So,
yeah.
In that case, well,
okay.
the first things first, I think we have to hear the piece of music in full. So let me just play that very quickly then, if that's alrighty. Here
that's
we go.
Fine by me. It's fine by me.
I can very much hear that. It's almost migrating between each ear.
Yes, right. This is the thing. So there's lots of as I mentioned, this song is largely made up of percussive instruments. So you've got at the very top, you've got a basic kick drum, which I've applied a high pass filter to get rid of a lot of the high end stuff. So it's all bass. Okay. All of it is bass, effectively, and that's panned. That's basically panned centrally, but it's a 3% stereo width, so it's got a very defined sound in the very middle because it's doing a kick on every beat of the song to give a kind of consistent rhythm and a beat to it.
Okay.
So I've also got stuff. Sorry, I keep interrupting.
No, it's absolutely fine. It's absolutely fine. So full disclosure, and my apologies in advance. Much of what you said, I didn't understand. So can we take a step back just for a moment and talk about what you've just said, because it sounded like words. So you mentioned that you had a high pass filter. Now I know that relates to the EQ page, which is this one here. But what do you mean when you say high pass filter or high cut frequency? What does that mean?
Okay, so a high pass filter is effectively actually no, I probably got it wrong. It's not. I don't think it's a high pass filter. It's a low pass filter. It's okay. So I've probably embarrassed myself live on the internet there by saying a high pass filter when it's really a low pass filter. But let's just say the high cut frequency bar, it cuts high end frequencies. It's so if you look at the graph there, you should see the line on the filter graph is kind of raised up around the lower frequencies. And what that means is I'm boosting those. So I'm making the lower frequencies of the sound louder. And what I'm doing to the higher frequencies, so the more tinny bits, is I'm getting rid of them entirely. So anything past what looks like the 1000 hertz bit at the bottom is going away completely. Everything past that halfway point is not in the sound anymore because I want to have a bass noise. I want to have something that's very bassy here. So none of those frequencies above that point are worth anything to me. Does that make sense?
Yes. However, what I'd like to do, just briefly here, is I'm going to play with this so I can actually or try and hear it for myself.
Okay.
Because I find that it makes more sense if I try and do that. So, okay, here we go. I'm going to play it.
So I would solo the field, though. I'd solo the track, though, just for this.
Yep, so I've got that. It's soloed. It's the only thing that's going to play.
Okay, good.
And if I play this and then I just kind of drag this down to the 39% it was at?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not sure how much of a difference you'll hear with this, because it's a bass drum anyway. There should be some like, maybe the sound of a kick or the sound of some resonance that at higher frequencies that will be gone. You should definitely hear a difference, though, because when it's at the 39% mark, it will probably sound a bit more artificial and more like it's just a bass throb than an actual kick, if that makes sense. So yeah, just play around with it.
Perfect. Okay, so I will do that now. Stand by for just a moment while we listen to this losing its high frequency. Listen to me sounding like I know what I'm talking about. Okay,
what do you mean you don't know what you're talking about? What a silly thing to say.
Okay, here we go.
So you should probably notice that's a fairly subtle change. I'm not going to argue that it isn't, but it should be noticeable to an extent. You should be able to hear the difference there.
Yes, absolutely. I know, I understand exactly what high pass filter means now. It's kind of almost the
superb.
Yes, I couldn't describe it as eloquently as you can, but I understand what that did to the audio as I applied that. Yes.
Okay, good. Right, I've accidentally just turned off my PS4 with my foot, so let's continue while I turn it back on.
That's absolutely fine. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be an absolute monster.
Oh God, while I'm away from my PS4.
Yeah, absolutely, but you can't stop me.
No!
I am going to edit all of your audio pieces with a keyframe. I'm going to turn off stereo balancing on everything that I can and flatten and muddy everything. Because then I will be able to hear the difference with the press of a keyframe. And I think that will help me understand some of what we're saying here.
The thing is, with this song, this is why I was talking about this song specifically, because I play around here with the panning to such a degree. Everything is all the percussive bits are spaced out a lot from each other. So bringing them all back into the middle should have a really obvious effect here.
Okay, excellent. So I will do that. I have been somewhat thrown by the fact that you have nested timelines as well. So you're making my life somewhat more difficult here.
I'm very sorry. It's okay. The nested timelines aren't as important.
No problem at all. It's absolutely fine.
It's okay, because with the new music update, you don't need to do nested timelines anymore. Haha!
Oh, so this was so you could apply your filter fields. That's how you were achieving this previously.
That's how I was. That's actually for the synth leads and the bass line. I apply a weird, I think it's a granular synthesis filter that's going on there.
Okay.
But it's also not important because that's not percussive. But whatever. It doesn't matter. I'm going to have a look at it myself. I've got my PS4 on again.
Huzzah! Okay. So, I've now flattened all of this with a keyframe, because I'm an absolute monster. So I'm going to now apply my keyframe partway through your audio track at a random interval. And I'm going to hear it flatten everything. Okay.
And I've done exactly the same thing on my copy of the game, so I can hear just how horrible it is.
Excellent. Right. I am going to play this through a couple of times to try and hear how this sounds. Here we go.
All the parts are still there. but they're much less well defined. They're much more poorly defined because all the percussion is coming from effectively the exact same place in the field. So whereas before you'd have a distinction between, I don't know, the stomps and claps bit at the top and the shekere, because the shekere is panned almost all the way to the right, and the stomps and claps are panned just under halfway to the left. There should be a very clear distinction, for instance, between those two instruments. But when you put all of them back in the middle, there's very little of that. That goes away, so they become very indistinct. And it becomes very difficult to pick things apart.
Yes, I definitely heard a difference with that keyframe turned on versus with that keyframe turned off. Let me just do that once more and just do that with the keyframe not in the timeline so I can just turn it off and on at will. For 1 moment, here we go. I definitely hear a difference, certainly coming through my speakers on that one. Again, I'm not sure whether that will necessarily come through to folks listening in the podcast. It suddenly occurred to me that I'm not quite sure how the audio from this is recording. I'm not sure whether it's recording in stereo or not. So I'll apologise now in advance to everyone just in case that just didn't sound any different at all. I promise you it does, and absolutely you should be doing these things at home.
I promise it does as well. I promise it does. You have my word for it that it sounds different. And also, and if you say it doesn't sound different, well, I won't listen to you. There we go.
Excellent.
But yeah, it's basically when you do that, it makes it sound more flat. It makes it sound, for want of a better word, it's not as dynamic. There's nothing. It doesn't feel real, you know. It doesn't feel like things exist.
Now that is a phrase I have heard before. I have heard I'm not suggesting that of my music at all, but I have heard people refer to music as being flat. Now, if I have understood what you've said, what you're referring to is that rather than their music sounding like it has appropriate space from the instruments, what they've done is they have nestled all of their instruments all together and they're all coming from the same space and they all sound just the same. And that's what makes it sound flat?
Yes, I would definitely say that. There are other things that can contribute to a piece sounding flat. Like just to go on a little tangent, very, very briefly, going back to the EQ and the frequencies. If you're not really playing with those much, you can use the EQs. You can use EQ to boost things and make things pop out more. But if we're talking, sorry, actually, you know what? This tangent doesn't make any sense. We're not going to talk about this bit. Yes, you're right. You're completely right, Phreaky. If you don't touch the panning, it does make it sound flat. It really does. It makes it sound very flat indeed.
Excellent.
And that is likely what you've heard people referring to.
That makes sense. I understand that now, at least from a first principles point of view. I'm not a sound, I guess, engineer, technician? I'm not a sound engineer, but yeah. I can hear the difference between my piano being in the center and my violin also being in the center versus my piano being in the right and my piano being on the left somewhat and my violin being on the right somewhat. It adds a fullness and a richness to the overall impact of the audio.
Precisely. Oh. Exactly. And really, like, when you're doing mixing and stuff like that, it really is taking those principles and building them up across a song. The individual steps themselves aren't terribly complex, but they do involve a lot of experimentation and playing around to hear what sounds right. Rather than there are rules for how you should go about mixing, but really what sounds right depends on what you want out of the song, what you want to be most prominent, where you want things to be placed. That's your decision. There's not really a wrong or right answer for that. But doing that and paying attention to it, even just being aware of like managing your volumes and playing around with the stereo field, just being aware of that and making an effort to change it will make your songs sound better. Even if you're not touching the melody or anything, it will absolutely have a concrete effect. So I urge you to look at that sort of stuff.
Perfect. Okay. So I feel like I'm inadvertently almost learning by osmosis quite a lot here about sound design principles, which is
Yay!
kind of amazing, really. So what I'd like to do is I would like to now explore. We've talked about volume and how the different audio levels that things are at has an impact on the overall sense of um, the way in which the music sounds. We've talked about positioning of that audio in terms of the stereo space, but I've also found instances previously whereby I will create a piece of music and either it doesn't do anything over the duration of the audio, or it's very I want to say one note, and I don't mean it only has one note in it. I mean it starts and then music happens and then it's the end and the music doesn't like the. I'm struggling with my terminology here, but there's not been on a journey. The music hasn't been on a journey, and therefore I don't feel like the music progresses. It doesn't do anything.
Yes. Again, this is something that is completely understandable, and it's something that is, again, very hard to get right. I just said that that mixing and mastering is something that you kind of have rules for, but a lot of it comes from yourself and what you want. When it comes to what I'm going to call the flow of the song, there really aren't any rules there, and all of it is to do with how something feels to you. So,
Okay, so
what I'd like to, yeah. Oh, sorry. Continue. Yeah.
let me. So, full disclosure, you sent me something beforehand, in preparation for this conversation. And what I want to do is I want to very quickly try and draw this out so that everyone understands exactly what we're talking about here.
Oh
So
yes. Oh
if
yes.
I draw that and I do that, and what we say is, let me just change my tool here. We'll do that. Okay, so if that over there, going that direction, is time, and this up here, what would we call this upward direction on the axis?
I would call it either energy or intensity.
Okay, so I'm going to go with an E for energy because that's easier to do than an I. So essentially, what I'm saying is that when I do my music, it kind of does something along the lines of this. And it kind of doesn't really change sometimes. Or alternatively, what sometimes will happen is I'll end up with something that kind of all of a sudden it'll have a really unnatural lull because I know it has to do something, and then it'll have another unnatural lull at another point because it has to do something, and it doesn't really have much impact. And that's really not very good as far as music's concerned. So
Yeah, it's difficult to get this sort of thing right. Your graph looks better than the one I mocked up, by the way. Good job. But yeah, this is something that is genuinely very tricky, and it's something that I've struggled with, and it's incredibly nebulous because it's getting the flow of a song right really does just come down to what it feels like. But getting it right, getting the tonal shifts and getting the changes in tone, changes in dynamics, and all that, changing the changes in instrumentation, that really does elevate a piece. So, where would you like to start with this actually? Because this is something that is, like, as I say, it's fairly nebulous, but I know there's a lot. It's something that's got a lot of nuance to it. So
okay, so let's demonstrate this then with a piece of music. I've got some of your music in front of me.
yes,
You mentioned one piece of music that you felt had quite a lot of movement in it. Was it this one? Is that correct?
No,
It
should be fairly near the start because it's a recent piece I published called "Step Out of This Life" because I made it with the new orchestral tools. So it'll be one of my recents.
Okay, so let me open this up. Let me have a look at the timeline itself, and we are talking. So it's 2 minutes 31.
Okay.
And so I'm going to cheat a little bit here. So what I'm going to do is looking at the music panel, for want of a better phrase. So just
the
looking
timeline,
at that's the word I was looking for that I couldn't think of. So just looking at this and how many instruments are involved, I am going to make a somewhat educated guess on what I think this might look like if I were to graph it out. And then you can tell me whether you feel like that's accurate or not. Because we've got not huge numbers of instruments here, some fairly heavy volume of instruments here. Then there's a period with fewer instruments, and then there's a period of far more instruments, and then it tails off. So I think that this is going to be something along the lines of this. If I can find my way to get into this painting. There we go. I think it's going to be something like this. Approximately something along those sorts of lines. So you've got a bit of a build, and then a bit of a quieter bit, and then a much bigger build, and then it eases off.
Yeah, we'll say that. That works about well. So the thing with this song, the reason I think this demonstrates the concept quite well, because you're right. The instrumentation is changing a lot in this song. So it goes through ebbs and flows of being quite quiet and sparse, as you can see with the starting, say, quarter of the song. There's only 3 things playing at any given time. So we've got here, we've got the church organ playing at the top. That's playing an ostinato, which is effectively a very short, repetitive phrase. And in this case, it's an upwards chord sequence, an upwards broken chord sequence. So that's sort of the bass line. And then we've got the oboe at the bottom playing the melody. We've got some ambient wind chime noises and some viola harmonics at the bottom, which is providing a sort of ambient noise tying it together. So there's not a lot of sound going on there. It sounds quite distant. It sounds quite melancholy in a way. There's nothing playing, almost. There's very little going on. But what is there is I've raised sort of to the front. Then we move into this second section where I elaborate more on what I just did. So this set of these set of blocks here that you're over now is the same as the first section, but I've laid some strings over the top as well as piano and some pizzicato strings and such like that. So this is bringing the intensity up a bit because there's more going on. There's more happening in this song, but the tone is still the same. This tone is still very slow paced. It feels quite lethargic. It still feels quite melancholy and sad. The tone hasn't changed here, but the instrumentation has. So I've also introduced a little bit of flute, and then we build up to the end of this section with the orchestral drum roll, and we stop. We hit this with this little gap in the music where there's the cymbals symboling the next phase, and we drop a load of the instruments out again. But here, the important change to note here is that the pace of the song is markedly different because at the top I've got a plucked piano piece and I've got a grand piano loud at the bottom, which are playing the same part in different octaves and at different parts of the field. An octave is just for quick reference. An octave is how high up the piano you are, or how high up the notes you are. So if you were in the first octave of an instrument, you're right at the bottom, you're playing the very bassiest of the bass notes. Whereas if you're at the highest octave, you're playing only the highest stuff. So the pace here is much quicker. it's kind of much happier already. It's getting a bit more jaunty, and it kind of feels like you're tiptoeing through something. It feels like you're in a forest or something. The tone is different from before, but I've dropped a lot of the instruments out. And then into that second segment of this section of the song, I start bringing the strings back in to start reintroducing a bit of that complexity and intensity, to bring things back up in preparation for the final bit of the song, where everything I've introduced as of yet is playing all at once. So I've got in the final section, it's quite bombastic. It's truly quite happy at this point. It's we've got lots of strings playing. We got the oboe, the clarinet, and the flute all playing the same melody, again in different octaves. So they're playing as an ensemble here rather than the oboe being by itself. So it feels more united almost. And then we've got at the bottom, we got the same ambient viola harmonics that I had at the start to kind of tie it back into that section. But I've also got stuff like the brass going on to accentuate some bits. I've got a violin section marcato that is doing the same sort of job there, adding a bit of harmony. And then I kind of raise it up as it goes, and it sort of builds to a crescendo at the end of that section, and all of it drops out again to just the oboe and just the church organ, like it was at the very start. And then it ends on a kind of happy major chord that's kind of sustained over a long period of time to kind of relax the listener out of the song, and ends with a little bit of a flourish on the oboe and the flute. But generally, what I kind of wanted to get at with that is that the song is still clearly, even though there are two distinct sections to the song, both are very clearly cut from the same cloth. The second section leads very clearly on from the first. It feels like it's a cohesive. I don't want to sound like I'm blowing my own trumpet, but it's cohesive. It develops and advances as the song goes on. Instruments go away and they come back in. Phrases are dropped and then they're reintroduced later. So it evolves as the song continues, which kind of creates a bit of a dynamic feel to the song, and it keeps it. I don't want to be presumptuous, but it keeps it interesting for the listener, because you can't instinctively know what's going to happen next. So while you still have the grounding of the church organ to grasp onto, because that section stays more or less the same throughout the whole piece, you've got changes to the oboe, you've got changes to the melody, the surrounding bits change, but you've got the grounding to latch onto as we continue. So this creates a piece where the emotion changes throughout, and it's not uniform. Crucially, the point I'm trying to make is that it is not just bombastic, and it is not just quiet or just sad or just happy. It changes and bits come and go to try and change the feel of the piece as it goes on. And hopefully that stops whoever's listening getting exhausted halfway through it, because that's a very real risk when you're making music, of just making something and it feels like it goes on and it goes on and it just keeps going on until it stops and it's over. And that's something you really want to try and avoid.
Yes.
Yes.
I understand. One of the things that I think is really, really interesting from where I'm coming from now is that as I'm hearing what you're saying, what I'm now tempted to do is actually play this all the way through with that graph underneath in full plain sight, so that I can hear exactly what it is that's happening. So I think what I'm going to do now, because I'm conscious that we're kind of approaching the end of this podcast, and one of the things that I'd really like to do is play this piece right the way through at a fairly respectable volume, and be able to acutely listen for very specifically where is this audio coming from in terms of the left and the right. What is the volume happening? What's happening with the volume of each of these instruments and throughout the course of the track, and also what's happening with the overall energy of the track and the emotion, as you say. And with all of that with a mind of the graph that's going on underneath, so I can kind of see all of that play out. Would that be okay?
That would be perfectly fine by me if it's okay by you.
Wonderful.
I'm more than happy to sit back.
Excellent. Well, I'm actually gonna mute my microphone so there's no background noise, and I'm just gonna play the track through with all of that in mind.
Okay, I will do the same.
We'll come back as soon as this track is done. It's only 2.5 minutes long, but I'm really looking forward to this. So yeah, here we go. That was really, really, really lovely, and because I knew what I was listening for, and because I had that visual representation on screen, I kind of understood a lot more about what I was hearing.
Oh, that's so great to hear. Thank you. But I'm glad that really comes across because it's an important concept to know, even if you don't completely execute on it with every song you make. Just being aware of the changes and the ebbs and flows of the song and how you can change that is really important, and it's really helpful to know when you're composing. I see actually one problem I do have with this song is it is overall a little bit too quiet, I think. But again, as I was saying before, I would rather err on the side of things being a little bit too quiet than being too loud. But that's just me.
No, I understand what you're saying. I think one of the things that struck me, particularly again to refer back to this graph that you've got, is this kind of trough that you've got in the middle in terms of the, I don't know if it's energy or ambience or impression of the track. You've got that period in the center where it does kind of cut away to the more whimsical, the way you've got your plucked piano kind of running up and down a scale. In that moment, actually, that's one of the really. I'm trying not to sound like I'm on BBC Radio 4, but it's one of the challenges that I have is that's one of the most powerful parts of this piece for me. It's the calm before the storm of what comes thereafter, and I think it's. I want to talk about the fact that in order to make that more impactful, you've actually removed things from it.
Yes, though this is the thing. It's really, really important when you've got a song that raises in intensity. Like in this song where we have the first peak, it's really important, I find, to give the listener a release from that. So you have a lot of tension that's building up, and then at the halfway point it drops. The tension's released, which is important because it has a sense of relief to it. But then as the song continues, it builds up again, and it builds to a bigger crescendo at the end, which is then dropped out again for a second bit of tension relief. And I feel like that process of building the tension up and then releasing it in a sort of cathartic way, having everything resolve, is kind of what makes songs emotional. And this is kind of consistent across a lot of types of music. Even if you listen to, let's say, The Prodigy, if you listen to stuff like that's like really grungy 90s UK like D&B stuff, you still kind of see these principles being applied. It's not all one level of intensity all the time, because if a song is going full on all the time, then nothing has any weight to it. There's no distinction between what's supposed to be powerful and what isn't supposed to be. So, which kind of gets it can lend it. It can get to the point where the listener gets bored because they feel like they've heard everything the song has to offer. They feel like, oh, I've hit the halfway point, but nothing's changed. It's just doing the same thing over and over again, and it can get exhausting. If the tension in the song is held for long enough, you just get tired and you get you get exhausted that this intensity isn't being let go, that it isn't going away. Because for the tension to have any impact at all, there has to be times where there's none of it. So it's really managing that balance of having bits of high intensity against bits that are quiet and peaceful, but have lingering hints of things that are to come. That, I think, is the key.
It's a little bit like, again, I'm going to use an analogy here because it's how my mind works. But to me, it's a little bit like if you're watching a film that's an incredibly harrowing, challenging, difficult scene, they'll very carefully structure in moments where there is a light-hearted, however minor, but there's a light-hearted moment of comedic relief. Or even in comedy, with a joke, you've got that build of expectation and then flipping it on its head, and that's where the joke lands. You've got to have that moment of flip, for want of a better phrase. Is that? Would you say that that's a fair analogy to make?
Yes, that's completely right. Because the thing. This principle doesn't just apply in music. It kind of applies across loads of mediums. Like as you just said, in filmmaking, that's the case as well. So if a film was all really intense and all really scary and all really it's horrible all of the time, then the effect of it starts to get dampened, and it starts to lose the impact because it's always happening. All of it's happening all the time. And so you just get bored and you start to care less. And you can sort of see the same thing in game design as well. So there's this principle of flow, of keeping the player challenged enough that they aren't bored, but give them enough releases that they don't get frustrated at the game. And that, I feel like that kind of principle broadly applies here as well. So it's constantly about managing how the thing feels. Well, I really genuinely think that's one of the most important things you can learn, is making it so that it's dynamic and it doesn't feel all the same. Because when things don't all feel the same, the bits where it changes stick out even more, and they get their impact. And that's really important.
Yes, I completely understand what you mean. And I think that I feel like we've covered that really quite well. And I know that's me kind of being quite self-aggrandizing, but I genuinely feel like I understand this better than I did before we started talking. And selfishly, that's all I care about. So we've succeeded. And what I also like is that diagram has now become new artwork within my little audio room. And what we've done is we've done a really rather marvelous version of kind of deconstructing audio. And I really like that. So
I'm glad that's helpful. Honestly, I feel like I was just rambling, but it's really if that if if it helps get that concept across, I'm really really happy because like I'd love to I it's something that's so hard to get right, but when you do get it right, it's satisfying not only for knowing you've written the piece, but knowing that your piece, that your song, or even in the case of media like films and stuff, even knowing that that has affected people in a profound way is even more of a reward. Knowing that you have that sort of power. It's weird and it's crazy and it sounds a bit evil, but I love that. That's what I like about this, is affecting people emotionally through this. And that's how you do it.
And I think that's one of the most remarkable things is that if I think about some of my favorite films, some of the most impactful moments aren't from words in the script. They're from moments that happen within the music itself. I mean, so again, I'm going to speak very personally for me, very briefly. But the piece of music at the end of Gladiator is again spoiler free, but the piece of music at the end of Gladiator is sensational because it summarizes the emotional journey of the entire film. Also, Interstellar is another great example of the power of music. Um, it's tragic and sad, but another one that I can immediately think of is The Lord of the Rings. You know, when the
Yeah.
brass comes in, you got that bum bum bum
Yes,
bum.
exactly.
You feel your chest swell, and you kind of it's something's happening, and the impact that that can have on you as a participant and a viewer, and again, very very much so in games is huge, and it makes such a difference. And I do feel, and I'm just as bad as the next person, but I do feel that good, structured, well thought out, intelligent sound design and music design within games is something that makes or breaks a game.
Yes, exactly. Right. In the example of the Lord of the Rings, if the brass was going all the time when, even if the moment you were talking about where the brass is playing and makes your chest puffs up stays exactly the same, if in the context of the rest of the film it was just playing all of the time, it would have no impact at all. Nothing would work because it's all about using things sparingly and knowing when to use, um, knowing when to really get all the guns out, so to speak. But yeah, it's and like with there's loads of examples of games doing this sort of thing. Like I think one of my most favorite memories of sound design and music design in a game recently was Doom 2016 with the introduction of the game with there's a scene where you step into an elevator and you're going out of an underground lab and you pick a shotgun up and the music is playing
I
in the
know it.
background.
I know the
Yes,
moment I know
exactly.
exactly the moment
You
you're
know
talking
exactly
about.
what I'm going to say. It's the moment where the music is building to a crescendo and it completely stops, and you hear the the reloading of the shotgun. You hear the cocking, the chamber going. I don't know gun terms, but you know what I'm talking about. And it's
Yes.
that. It's like I'm a badass. That is
Yes.
exactly the feel that that song gives you, and that's the tone for the rest of the game. And it's it's just the way it can affect you is so it's it's just wizardry when people do it right. And that Doom example is just amazing to me. It's so cool. I
Yes.
love it.
And there are a few games that I can think of that hopefully we'll talk about another time. But
Yes,
there are a few
yes.
games that I can think of where the impact of the music has been pivotal, if not my overriding memory and nostalgic experience of the entire game. I couldn't tell you the gameplay mechanics that I enjoyed about the game, but I've then gone away and I've actually got the vinyl for that game because
Hmm.
the audio has been so sensationally implemented that it has just resonated with me so much. And hopefully we get to explore that in another conversation
Yes.
because I'm
Music
conscious.
lingers. It lingers in your mind, and
It
that's the most
does.
powerful thing it has. That's the most power. That's the power of music. It stays behind long after the actual associated memories of it have gone. I played Shadow of the Colossus probably about 10 years ago. But there are songs in that have affected me so deeply that I don't think I'll ever forget them, even if I don't remember the exact context they happened in, because I remember the feeling I had when I heard it for the first time in the context. And that's what's powerful.
Yes, absolutely, 100%. And I think that's a really clever way to bring us around to a way to close out the podcast. There's only one way I can think to close out the podcast, and that's to now play our full scene with our graph on the wall and with our instruments on the left and right and sized appropriately to represent the volumes that we would have them at. And yeah, I think we will close out hearing the same piece of music again because it is a beautiful piece of music.
Oh, thank you.
It really is. I think it's a lovely piece of music. It's called Step Out of This Life. It's an orchestral track using the brand new instruments in the most recent Dreams update, which is available right now. Everything that has been achieved in this podcast on screen is capable for anyone out there in Dreams to do. And yeah, I would like to take a moment to say an enormous thank you to Mandelbo. And yeah, hopefully we will hear from you again in a future episode. It has been thoroughly enjoyable to talk to you. It's been a real pleasure, and I genuinely have learned a huge amount that I simply just wasn't aware of before. And I think the most powerful thing that you've given me is that I'll have a new appreciation for what I'm hearing when I hear it. Thank you ever so much.
That's lovely, and seriously, thank you very much for having me on here. It's been an absolute pleasure, Phreaky. It's been really nice. Thank you. I do hope I'll come back some other time.
Fingers crossed. Fingers crossed. Hopefully, we hear from you again soon.
Okay.
Then, in that case, I shall now play this piece of music, and I'm just going to play the scene and let it speak for itself. And yeah, we will catch you all next time.